Good morning. I'm sorry I can't be there this week to present this fascinating data in person, but I do want to discuss it through this video and show you some of the details that we've already figured out. As an added bonus, this video will be available on our YouTube channel for those who want to go back and review it later, or for those who just can't be here at our Sunday meeting. So what I want to talk about today is the results of the poll we commissioned back in April that probed the province's religious beliefs and their attitudes towards various secular values, both in politics and education. Over the past years, we've always held some sort of image or stereotype of what the average non-believer might look like, and I think it's important as skeptics to try to verify those ideas against the data and to test whether the values we hold, those of the separation of religion and politics, play well among the rest of the province. Additionally, we saw the first release of data from the 2011 National Household Survey in early May, which replaced the long-form census. This survey has some methodological concerns that I'll touch on later, but it does add a wealth of data to our repertoire. Now, before I go too far into the raw numbers, I want to address one of the first concerns that you might have. On May 14th, the polls and pundits told us that Adrian Dix would be the premier of a new BC NDP government. In reality, the closest election prediction was off by more than 8%, and Christy Clark returned the BC Liberals with a majority government. It's clear that the political and electoral polling in BC has suffered a hit to its reputation. I'm not too qualified to speak on the methodological issues that each company might have, but some early analysis seems to suggest that the pollsters misestimated the turnout for each age range. Where they thought more uniform turnout might happen across ages, in reality those under 35 eschewed election day, leaving the election to be decided by those over age 55. If this is just the dominant issue at play, our data should still be valid, especially as it roughly tends to confirm the data in the National Household Survey. Of course, you should exercise due skepticism and perhaps give a little more flexibility in these numbers, but I'll leave that to you to discuss after the presentation. So let's dig in. I want to start by reminding you of the 2001 census data. As part of the mandatory long-form census, 36% of the province of BC reported no religious affiliation. The only less religious region in Canada was the Yukon Territories, but BC was still the least religious province, especially compared to the Canadian average of 17%. It's important to note that in 2001 census, as well as in the 2011 National Household Survey, Statistics Canada asked, "What is this person's religion?" and to indicate a specific denomination or religion, even if this person is not currently a practicing member of that group. Now, this question is obviously problematic and will bias many people who may no longer attend church or even believe in God to answer what their culture is or what they were raised in, what religion they were raised in. So, for example, the census reports that the province of Quebec is the most religious province, with 83% saying they're Catholic in 2001, despite the people of that province essentially repudiating the teachings of the Vatican. So let's start off with where we are now, in 2013, with the results of our association's poll. I want to start with what the demographics of beliefs are before I move into the demographics in the National Household Survey, and I'll finish with a discussion of what our secular values are. One of the values of commissioning the poll by ourselves as an association is that we're able to specify how we'd like the data broken down, and from there we've been able to start to build a profile of various non-religious communities in this province. As I mentioned before at the annual general meeting, our poll was conducted in mid-April among a sample of 600 BC adults, contacted both online and by telephone. The advantage of this approach by Justason Marketing is that often online polls have a self-selecting bias of younger engaged citizens, while telephone polls sometimes oversample older demographics, since it doesn't always capture the growing population that only has cell phones. Based on this approach, Justason pegs that the data is accurate to plus or minus 4%, 19 times out of 20. And of course the margin of error is larger on smaller demographic data, since there are fewer responses. So to tease out the difference between our data and what potentially is reality in the province and the census, we first asked, do you participate in or practice a particular religion or faith? Overall, only 1 in 3 people in BC are actively religious, with nearly 2/3 making up the non-religious community of the province. In other words, of the 4.3 million people in BC, 2.8 million are not practicing a religion. Next, we know that not everyone who is non-religious is an atheist, so we asked, regardless of whether you participate in or practice a particular religion or faith, do you believe in a higher power? To this, 70% said yes, another 20% said no, and the remaining 9% did not know or were unsure. This is slightly higher than the Canadian average, which was found in a 2011 Environics poll, which found 17% of the country did not believe in a universal God or spirit, compared to 79% who did. You can find details about that poll at the link in the corner, and I'll post that in the write-up and on the YouTube channel for this talk. Next, since we know that only 1/3 of the province is religious, we can test the depth of that belief. Specifically, we asked, how often do you attend religious services such as church, synagogue, or mosque or temple? What we found is that only 15% of the province attends on a weekly basis or more, while 68% never attend church. Even among those who participate in a religion, only 44% are active in their church, attending on a weekly basis. Almost as many, 40% of those who participate in a religion attend only a few times a year or less. So BC is a province where churchgoers are the exception rather than the rule. Now we know all of those who don't practice a religion are not atheists, but we can start to break down where the nones fall with our data. Of the religious, it should be no surprise that a full 97% believe in a higher power. However, the non-religious are more divided. 58% still believe in some higher power or God despite not practicing a religion. We might call this the spiritual but not religious crowd. But among the non-religious, a strong 30% are atheists and another 12% are unsure or agnostics. We can flip the tables around and see that theists, those who believe in a higher power, are divided between the religious and non-religious in how they practice, with the advantage going slightly to the non-religious. That polarization disappears among agnostics, who are predominantly non-religious or unsure if they practice a religion. Well, very, very few are actually religious among the agnostics. Also, unsurprisingly, 97% of atheists are not religious. We could be curious for a second about the 3% of atheists that describes themselves as religious. They are perhaps that fundamentalist atheist that you hear about, but this results also within the margin of error. Next, we can ask where the least religious parts of BC are. Unsurprisingly, the city of Vancouver and Vancouver Island are among the least religious, while the interior and northern BC come out as highly religious, or relatively more religious in our poll. One thing that is interesting to note is that the balance of Metro Vancouver, that is Surrey and the suburbs, is slightly more religious than the provincial average, making Metro Vancouver as a whole about as religious as the entire province. This is confirmed in the National Household Survey and may point to the growth of the immigrant religious communities in Richmond and Surrey. We'll have to look closer at these demographics later and see what we can learn in the future. Breaking our data down by gender, we find that men and women are fairly close on whether or not they practice a religion, with men being slightly less religious than women. However, when we asked about a higher power, we find that men are significantly more likely to say no or to be an atheist than women. I'm not sure exactly how to explain this gap. Women aren't more likely to be agnostic. In fact, 13% more women believe in a higher power than men, so I guess we have work to do to close these gaps. Looking at the non-religious community by ethnicity, we find that East Asians, those from China, Japan, or Korea, were far more likely to be non-religious at 75%, while those from South Asia and the South Pacific, countries like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, or the Philippines, were more religious on average. Nevertheless, there are some strong South Asian freethought groups operating even right here in Metro Vancouver, such as Tark Sheel, which represents the Indian rationalist movement, and there is a contingent of secular Bangladeshi expats who support the atheist bloggers who are being persecuted by rising Islamic fundamentalism in their homeland. Wrapping up my comments on the demographics of the non-religious from our poll, we didn't find a very large difference in the religiosity versus age. I plot that here in the corner with the error bars of 4% to show that there might be a small bump in the middle age demographic, but it is within our margin of error. We did find that religious households are 15% larger than non-religious households though, so perhaps as people have children they become more religious for that brief period. We did find that younger generations were more likely to not believe in a higher power and to not attend church than the provincial average, and similarly, of those making more than $100,000 a year, only 7% attend church on a weekly basis. There's definitely lots more demographic data in our tables, and we'll definitely try to share it as we analyze it. Now I want to put our poll numbers into context by discussing the results of the 2011 National Household Survey. After that, I'll return to our poll to discuss the province's attitudes towards secularism that we were able to probe. A few years ago, there was an outcry from statisticians and academics across Canada as the Harper government decided, seemingly out of the blue, to cancel the mandatory long-form census and replace it with the voluntary National Household Survey that we have today. The government cited, seemingly without any evidence, that complaints about the intrusive nature of the survey violated Canadians' liberties. To account for the inevitable bias that might creep in from a non-response rate, the government demonstrated how little it understood statistics by announcing the voluntary survey would just be sent to more homes. This means that the survey ended up costing more money than the census while producing less valuable data, as marginalized and impoverished communities, especially First Nations, would be less likely to respond. Overall, Statistics Canada announced that only 69% of the province of BC who received the survey returned it to them. This compares to a response rate that was much more than 90% when the form was mandatory. In some cases, the response rate was so low in smaller municipalities that Statistics Canada refused to release the data, which it had deemed too compromised to be reliable. Nevertheless, the survey data does represent the response of millions of Canadians, and I like to believe that Statistics Canada went to some effort to ensure its validity. Compared to our poll, which featured a relatively small sample size and was entirely voluntary, the National Household Survey responses are still valuable to consider. Let's just make sure we take them with a skeptical grain of salt. Province-wide, we see that the non-religious portion has grown from 36 to 44%, even including that disclaimer of when you are no longer practicing. We also find that some of the least religious municipalities in Canada are right here in BC, with the least of them being Squamish and Campbell River, where 55% claim no religion. Continuing on the trend by city, we see the municipalities on Vancouver Island are the least religious, while the Fraser Valley and in the interior, unsurprisingly, are the most religious. However, even in the buckle of the Bible Belt, Abbotsford and Mission still have a non-religious population of 32%, which is greater than the Canadian average of 24%. You'll also see on this graph that Metro Vancouver is a fairly small dot. Metro Vancouver comes in at only 41% no religion, which is below the provincial average, and we'll break that down a little. Going into Metro Vancouver and looking at each different municipality, we see that there's a Surrey Delta Metro Bible Belt. 49% of the city of Vancouver has no religion, as we would expect from our poll. However, Surrey comes out as the most religious municipality in BC, where only 29% express no religion. Meanwhile, Delta, 37% check no religion, and even in New Westminster on this side of the Fraser River, 39% have no religion. Richmond, on the other hand, is relatively average with the province, where 46% have no religion. We actually see religiosity drop in Maple Ridge and Langley, where the nuns make up 49% and 45% respectively. Spending just a little bit more time on Surrey specifically because it's so fascinating in an otherwise secular Metro Vancouver, we can look at how the religious identities break down. Looking at the data, it turns out a large portion of the religious population in Surrey is actually Sikh. Most of the religious in the city are still Christian, which are mainly Catholic or other Christians, but Sikhs make up nearly a quarter of the city. I think immigration trends suggest the growth of the Sikh community in Surrey is likely to continue, which will make for an ever-changing landscape in Metro Vancouver, especially as the population of Surrey overtakes that of Vancouver. Finally, I pulled out the data for age and gender from the National Household Survey for the non-religious community in BC. Here we can see the expected trend that most other surveys on non-belief in North America tend to find, with larger proportions of those under 35 expressing no religion. I'm tempted to suggest that those under 18 are potentially being misrepresented by their parents as having the same religion as them, because it's the parents who would fill out the survey for the entire household. So we might be suppressing some of their skepticism. We also see a gender gap in the non-religious, which actually increases slightly with age, from 6% for the 25 to 35-year-olds to 10% for 55 to 64-year-olds. Again, it's hard to know whether the children and youth are being accurately reported, but it doesn't seem like there is as much of a gender gap among the younger ones. Nevertheless, these poll numbers suggest the non-religious community will continue to grow in BC for the foreseeable future, potentially becoming an absolute majority on the census in the near future. We've covered a lot of ground already, but I want to finish off quickly with some discussion of the secular values that we probed with our poll. Again, we have a lot more demographic data to drill down on this, but we can begin to see what secular values are shared by the people of BC. You'll recall that back in February, Premier Christy Clark spoke before a small Christian audience at the Vancouver Club. At that meeting, she said, "We should be doing much, much more to involve faith communities in the work that our government does to serve the people." I think most of our association would disagree quite strongly with this idea, and it turns out that 60% of the province agrees with us. Only a very slim 7% actually strongly agree with the Premier that we should be bringing faith groups into the government. This is a very encouraging result for us, as it tells us that when we speak out against the government getting involved in religion, that we actually have sympathetic ears out there. We can turn this result back around to the Premier as a warning not to go down the faith initiatives path that the United States has. We can break this down even by party support and show that a plurality of each party, and in almost all cases a majority of voters, disagree with the Premier's proposal. Even hardcore BC Liberal supporters who were open about it back in April were split on whether or not to support the statements supporting faith groups. Similarly, nearly 2/3 of those making over $100,000 disagree with the Premier's plan, and not surprisingly, 75% of atheists disagree with the idea, with only 15% somewhat agreeing. When it comes to the federal government, 23% of BC fears the government has gone too far mixing religion and government, while 13% thinks the Harper government hasn't gone far enough. Most didn't have an opinion, though, which does represent space for us to start raising issues like the cuts to science funding and the millions of dollars going to Bible colleges like Trinity Western. Continuing on with the federal government, we see that a lot more atheists than theists are still concerned with the falling separation of church and state, which means our arguments will be well received among other non-believers. It is interesting to note, though, that even among those who believe in a higher power, they're evenly split on whether the government should be more or less involved in religion. Changing to public education now, we find that strong majorities of BC strongly disagree with the idea of public schools promoting specific religious ideologies or dogma. This bodes well for our efforts to oppose what is almost always Christian views encroaching on secular education in BC. There's also strong support for teaching world religion classes in BC, while the idea of banning religion entirely from the classroom is met with some more opposition. This suggests, and it's a position that I tend to sympathize with, that we ought to focus our efforts on promoting secular religion and ethics classes rather than attempting to purge all mention of religion from schools. On the other issues here, we can see soft support for encouraging students to explore their spirituality and slightly more opposition to encouraging students to explore options in organized religion. So in conclusion, British Columbia is an increasingly secular province. We have a lot to be optimistic about in these results, and our views on secularism seem to be shared with majorities of the province. In Metro Vancouver, immigration to Surrey and the suburbs is maintaining the religiosity that the rest of the province seems to be abandoning. It will be useful for us to take this data into consideration as we draft our strategies and campaigns for the coming years. Overall, I think this poll proved quite valuable for our organization and is something we should maybe think about replicating every year or two to start to build a trend line for the province. So I do want to thank everyone who helped make this poll possible with their donations. We can always use more support to help us reach out to the growing number of atheists and humanists in BC. Thank you.